Welcome to the Based Boomer podcast on Eschatology Matters, part of the Fight, Laugh, Feast network. Today, I have the great privilege of interviewing Jay Rogers, the author of the magisterial work, Puritan Storm Rising. And when I was thinking about how to introduce Jay in his book, I thought of the term magisterial, and it absolutely fits. It connotes expertise and a kind of breadth of knowledge that's amazing. And this book is that. And he's a man after my own heart because my previous book is titled Going Back to Find the Way Forward. So we're going to talk about some of that specifically from a Puritan perspective. And without further ado, let's introduce Jay Rogers. How are you doing, sir?
Very good. How are you?
Good. Thank you for joining us and me and today. And wondered if we could just get started for those who don't know you, haven't been introduced, if you could just give us a little background, where you're from, family, career, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I do. I write quite a bit about that in my book and little snippets. Like I explain, what my background is and why I'm interested in this, what my experiences are. A lot of my research into this is like personal research, not just from books, but I actually lived in Framingham, Massachusetts, which is the town
Okay.
just south of Sudbury and Concord. So that those two areas were very big in the 1700s and 1800s. First, the Revolution. There was a lot of literary giants that came out of that area, like Emerson and Thoreau and Longfellow and people like that. Some Christian, some not. I was also a student at Amherst. Neighboring town was Northampton, so I've been to like Jonathan Edwards Church. And when I was an undergrad, I was an English and psychology major. And the English side, I studied American Lit, and you're right there in the area where these writers were, most of the early American writers were from New England. And so I got a little bit of background, Jonathan Edwards and so on. Now, after I was converted, which was after I was converted to Christ, I had a born again experience in 1985 after I graduated from University of Mass.
Okay.
I was able to really have a more deeper appreciation because I understood the whole history of revival and spiritual awakening was in this area. So my cousin and I started a newsletter. We wrote a lot about history and revival theology. And we met another guy from Ohio. His name was Jeff Sigler. He came to preach in our church. My pastor was like, you're going to like this
He
guy.
does the introduction
Yeah.
to your book.
Yeah. He died a few years ago, but he was a very good friend of mine.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, he passed away, but he was a good friend of mine. And so what happened was he came to our church and we took him on a tour of the North Shore where George Whitfield's church, places where George Whitfield preached and things like that. And just kind of like went over the history of the Great Awakening in New England, and he had things to say. So it was real interesting. And
Mm.
he came back several times to preach. And when I moved to Florida to join a publication called The Forerunner,
Okay.
and I've kind of everything I do now is The Forerunner. It's like forerunner.com, and I kind of have continued the publication online and through video and multimedia. But I I continued my writing on this. And whenever I've returned to Massachusetts, I've always done something, you know, visited Plymouth, Mass, done little video projects with Paul Jaley and things like that. And I've always tried to every time I go, I've tried to be a tourist in my own hometown, so to speak. I try to like deepen my knowledge of the Christian history of the area. Behind me on my wall, I have a collection of Christian books that I bought at antique bookstores in New England. And so I'm just writing over a period of time. We were going to do a publication called The Puritan Storm, and that never really, basically just a lot of the articles went on my website. I did another publication called The Boston Awakening, and it was some of the materials in Boston Awakening are in this book.
Okay.
What happened was we were working with some students at Harvard who were meeting every week and praying for revival for the campuses
Mm.
in Boston. This is around 2006. And someone approached me and said, "We'd like you to do a Boston Awakening magazine." And so I put the whole thing together, and I had the history of the Puritans and the Pilgrims and revivals in Boston from, you know, the beginning all the way up to the 1900s. And then we hope it's going to happen again, that type of thing. But when I presented the magazine, they said, well, it's kind of heavy on the Puritans and Calvinism. And I
Okay.
just kind of went like, well, okay. But I also had like, D.L. Moody was from Boston and Billy Sunday preached. I didn't like, it wasn't only about that.
Hmm.
But that's just the fact, is that
Exactly.
these are the people who, but to them, even to many Christians who are conservative Christians, they're not liberals, these are
Right.
conservative Christians. They look at the Puritans as almost like this 400-year-old embarrassment.
Hmm.
And so part of my goal then was to do a video, and we did video productions with Jeff and also with a couple other people, Paul Jaley and a guy I know from South Africa named Peter Hammond, you might know, is also a postmillennialist Calvinist. And so we're going to put together this video, and kind of like this was in the period where you could still sell a DVD, you know. And once that time had passed, I thought like, well, what I'll do is I'll put everything into a book, and I'll make the video curriculum available through the book. And I have in the book like a little 12-week discipleship course people can take, and they can sit down and watch the videos, and they can go through the book. And it's also suitable for high school students as well, people doing homeschool. So
Right.
that's how
Right.
the book came about, mainly because of my background and because of my love of revival history, the Great Awakenings, and just my personal experience with people. Like I was a member of R.C. Sproul's church here in Orlando for many
Oh,
years. He is an expert on Jonathan Edwards and the Puritans, so I got a lot of material out of that too. And
well, let me ask you, how you've sort of answered my second question about why you wrote the book, but I'm going to actually explore that a little bit more.
yeah,
But how did you come to postmillennialism? Because you obviously weren't born one.
yeah, it was around the time I met Jeff Sigler, as a matter of fact, because we were talking about this. We had a Bible prophecy expert come into our
So,
church,
and
which
what
is
were you before that?
I was a new Christian who, as a
Okay.
teenager, had read Tal Lindsay as a Roman Catholic
Me
kid.
too.
And I basically assumed that was it. But we had a prophecy expert come into our church, and when he explained it, now it made no sense. Like before, I thought I had it all figured out. And then as soon as he started explaining dispensationalism, I was like, wait a minute, this is just not
This is
what.
bizarre.
And I also remember going and looking at, like, for instance, Wesley or Edwards or even someone like a Charles Finney, who were these figures in the 1800s. They were all postmillennialists. And I remember the first time I read that, I said to myself, well, how could it be that these guys were so spiritual and they led these awakenings? How could they be so wrong about eschatology? And then I ran into this book. It was called Christ's Victorious Kingdom, Postmillennialism Reconsidered by John Jefferson Davis. He was a, um, a professor at Gordon Conwell. I actually taught in a school
Okay.
that was in Beverly, Mass, which is the next town over.
Right,
And I
right.
was in the bookstore one day and I picked up this book by books by our professors. And I was like, oh, now I can understand it, because it was a 100-page book. And I read through the whole thing and I go, oh, this makes sense. And he came to the same conclusion. He was studying the history of the missionary movements in the 1800s. He was like, why is it that almost to a man, all of these missionary leaders in the 1800s were post-mill? And in studying it, he became post-mill himself.
Hmm.
So I kind of like followed in his footsteps. And I've never met the guy, but I had a lot of respect for him because he was involved with the pro-life movement. And we were, like, involved with Operation Rescue in Boston. And that's part of my story too,
Well,
is we
I
need to be
found
able to change the culture as well as be pietistic Christians, where it's one thing to be holy
right,
on the inside, but our holiness also has to be a social holiness
right,
where we move outward. And that was part of the process too, as I realized, like, you can't just be in the pew and be listening to sermons and being an expert in the Bible. You have to go out into the culture, into your neighborhood,
right,
make disciples, and change things that are evil that are going on.
right. I found out that, like him, most people who don't embrace postmillennialism or reject it don't know anything about it, because I knew zero. But as soon as I started studying it, it's like, oh my gosh, there's an actual biblical case for this.
Right. Now,
So I can totally relate.
not all the Puritans were postmillennialists, but a good
Right.
a good portion of them were. They
Sure.
were all
And
over
even
the
if
map.
they weren't, though, they still believed that their faith was going to have an
Yeah.
impact in the culture. Like Wesley, I don't think he was
Yeah.
post mill per se, but he was very much, we need to influence the culture and,
Right. I mean,
proclaim
Oliver
Christ.
Cromwell would be a good example of that. He was primo, and he was kind of like, believe this is the fifth kingdom, and he
Right,
had this
right, right,
whole scenario, but he was not a theologian. He was a
right, right.
statesman. But what he
General.
did to change England and change America was,
Amazing.
we call them operational postmillennialists.
Right. That's a
The
good way.
people that
That's a good
believe
way.
that Jesus is coming back very soon, but operationally,
I
they're
like
working
that.
as though that's a term that Gary North came up with. I believe he may not have thought of it, but he
Okay.
popularized that. It's you can change the culture around you.
Right. And a lot more people today, especially like after Charlie Kirk, is like, we need, they're operational post millennialists,
Right.
many more than were ever in the past, when dispensationalism and this kind of a dualistic pietism was like the thing and so on and so forth. But in terms of the book, so I see why you wrote it, but why did you write it? I mean, what's your goal, your objective to get out of it, if you will?
I've wanted to write it for a long time. I mean, it was going to be a publication. It was going to be a a video, and I thought of doing these little spin-off books as part of the video. I did one called The United States of America 2.0, The Great Reset, and that's actually part three of the book.
Right.
I did another book on John Knox, and so what my goal is to do a whole series where each one of the figures in the book has a separate booklet that's like less than 100 pages long because there's so
Okay.
much. Like even this
Oh,
morning, I was looking at something that I wrote and I said, "Oh, I didn't put that in the book," and
I can
it's
relate.
already 400 and something pages. So I've done two 700-page books, and I said I don't ever want to do that again. So I want to like
No, that's
kind of
great because people are
spin
more
these off, and
inclined,
so
right,
I'll
to
have
read
a,
them
and basically
smaller.
the article is like Puritanism versus Pietism, which
Mm,
is what we were talking about. But and some of that is in the book, but I didn't put the whole thing in there.
right,
So I
right.
thought, well, I can do a spin-off and I can have that. So I've wanted to do it for a long time. And the most recent concept was if I we never did the video, so if we take everything that is in the video and basically I can do I can edit it. Everything that were in the videos, I can edit it and distill it into a book
Hmm.
and then offer the videos as supplemental materials through links. If people have the digital version, there are live links and they can go directly to the video and watch it
Oh, nice.
as they're reading the book or as part of the lessons at the end. So there's a whole lesson and study guide at the end of the book as well.
Right, right.
So I've
Very
wanted
helpful.
to do this. It's not just a book, but I want it to be a whole training curriculum and something that if people teach it and they make disciples, it can change America.
Amen. Absolutely. And so then I'll go to my actually fourth question. So about kind of the why is that why are the Puritans? I'll back up for a second. So I didn't think Puritans were, I didn't have a negative view of Puritans
Right.
for the most part, but I didn't realize, they're real relevant. So after I became post mill, I found, and as I was preparing for my book to write, Joe Booth's Mission of God, and it's basically taking Puritanism into the modern
Right.
world. I was like, wow, they're relevant. So, what is it about Puritanism that is so important, not just for America's past, which you talk about in the book, but for our future?
The most important thing to understand about the Puritans is that they didn't call themselves Puritans. First of
Mm-hmm.
all, like if you were to tell them a Puritan, they'd either take it as an insult or they wouldn't know what you were talking about.
Mm,
Um, there were two groups in Massachusetts. One of them were dissenters. They were separatists. Actually,
right.
one group were separatists. They were called the Pilgrims. They didn't call themselves Pilgrims either,
Mm-hmm.
but they wanted to separate from the Church of England, and they were a little bit more pietistic than the Puritans. But like you said, they still wanted to go out and change the world. They didn't come to America thinking we're all going to die when Jesus comes back next year. They were thinking about future generations.
Amen.
And then the Puritans themselves were dissenters within the Church of England, and they didn't want to, in the beginning, they didn't want to overthrow the king. They wanted the king to be a good Christian.
Right.
They ended up overthrowing the king, but so eventually the two groups began to see each other's side and they kind of came together. So it's not really even Puritanism. It's more like what I call the Boston Awakening,
Mm,
where there was an awakening that took place in Boston that was an extension of what happened during the Scottish Presbyterian movement. Like if you've ever read a book called The Puritan Hope,
yes,
Ian Murray,
I did.
that's all about that period. And people that know about the Great Awakening, they don't know that there was even a greater awakening that took place in Scotland
Mm.
about 200 years before that, in the 1500s and early 1600s,
Knox.
and well,
Mhm.
150 years before that.
Right.
And it was the type of awakening where every household in Scotland was affected by it. Someone was born again
Wow.
in your home.
Mm.
And the interesting thing about the Reformation in Scotland was it wasn't the king imposed it like in England with King Henry VIII. It was the people imposed it on the king
Right.
or the queen at that time. And they imposed it on the government. And so the entire nation of Scotland was born again.
Mm.
And they married Jesus. When they covenanted with God, they have a more peculiar view of, they were called the Scottish Covenanters. The
Right.
Puritans were not Covenanters. They believed that um, you know, that church and state should be separate. And you couldn't be a minister and hold civil office in Massachusetts.
Mm.
They believe the two governments operate. So we get that whole idea of like sphere authority, which later, like people like Abraham Kuyper and other people, they developed that.
Right. Right.
So that became like, so when in the book I try to emphasize it's not just I call it Puritan Storm Rising. People say you shouldn't use that word because it's negative. I'm not just writing about the Puritans. I'm writing about the Puritan movement, the the Presbyterian movement, Calvinism, what we call the Neo-Puritan awakening, which would have included Edwards, Whitfield, and even to a lesser extent the Methodists, because John Wesley and Whitfield were together. Whitfield was a Calvinist, but Wesley was an Arminian. But the Whitfield side, they were called the Welsh Calvinistic Methodists. A lot of people
Mm.
don't know that, but they were considered Methodists too. So it was all
Right.
this one
Right.
big movement. Half of them were Calvinist, the other half were Arminian. But we know today the Arminian side because they separated from the Church of England and they formed a denomination in America called the Methodist Church.
Right.
Um, and then there's also in the 1800s, the social reform movements in the 1800s were influenced by Neo-Puritanism, but not everybody was a Puritan. Like, for instance, in England, you had a guy named William Wilberforce.
Hmm.
Wilberforce was a really good friend of John Newton, who was a Calvinist,
Right.
but John Newton was the guy that wrote Amazing Grace. He was a former slave trader, and he wrote Amazing Grace about his experience being a sinner, like the worst sinner, someone that murdered people,
Mm.
legally murdered people. That could be like, say, an abortionist getting saved, and then he became a Christian, and he knew Wilberforce very well, and so there was a whole group around them. I forget their actual name. It's in the. That's why I write books to remember things, but it's in the book. So get the book if you want to know about that group. And then, but also Wesley influenced him too. So he didn't really want to pick sides. Like I don't want to say I'm a Calvinist. I don't want to say I'm an Arminian. I'm just a Christian. And he wrote a whole book on that, which was very influential about we need to go out on social reform and so on.
Nice.
Um, when R.J. Rushdoony did his history of Reconstruction, he included people like uh, the Salvation Army, William and Catherine Booth. And I don't talk about them in the book that much. I think I might mention them. I don't think I mentioned them actually, but they were worldwide evangelists. They were Methodists, though. Came out of the Methodist movement. They were influenced by
Hmm.
Finney and so on. So I don't have a chance to talk about all that, but I'm talking about that whole movement from that time, the World Mission Movement in the 1800s, Abraham Kuyper in Holland.
Right.
And a lot of Calvinists are very persnickety about this kind of stuff. They're like, oh, Abraham Kuyper, he didn't believe in, this.
Right.
Well,
Right.
okay, he didn't, but he did something. And then he influenced a guy named Cornelius Van Til, who was his disciple. And then Cornelius Van Til influenced Rushdoony and Francis Schaeffer, and Francis Schaeffer influenced. So it's like that whole movement, who are mostly Calvinists,
Right. Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
have really changed the world and they
Right.
continue to change the world. So I want people to get that vision.
Right. Changing the world. I used to think that was a pipe dream. Jesus is going to come back, and that's when it'll actually change. But I don't believe that anymore. So I was thinking too, as you were writing about covenant, which is an interesting concept, very Christian concept. Um, can a nation actually have a covenant as part of their governing ethos?
That's one of the things that people get, like I said, persnickety about. It's like people get like, oh, there's no national covenant. There's only one covenant with Jesus Christ, capital C. And I agree with that. There's only one covenant. God established it with Adam, with Abraham, with Moses, with David, all throughout the Bible. There's one covenant. It's renewed again and again. And finally, there's a new covenant that's sealed in the blood of Jesus Christ.
Right.
But when an individual comes to God, they become part of the covenant. When a family comes to God, does the family become part of the covenant, or is a family a separate secular? No, a family is a Christian family. They're part of the
Right,
covenant.
right, right, right,
What about a church? Can a church be in covenant with God? If you stretch Christians far enough, they'll go that far.
right,
Yes, our
right.
church can be in covenant with God. We can have a church covenant. But when you start talking about a national covenant, that's when people start to protest.
Right.
And
Well,
I
they
don't
see it as
agree.
so individualistic,
Yeah, I think that as
content.
as a nation, as families, individuals, churches, community organizations, as they follow the covenant of God, that there's a cultural covenant where we as a civilization are covenantal. And then you
Mm,
could say that we have a national covenant and so on. Like if the Puritans certainly believed that, because if you look at the early compacts and constitutions of states, it starts off in the name of Jesus Christ and so on.
right.
Look up the Massachusetts Constitution, which was written in 1780. It sounds a lot like the U.S. Constitution, but it's all about Jesus.
Mm,
Our U.S. Constitution should have been that way, but as you know,
yeah,
there was some dissent. But we can still, I believe, I don't have a problem with operating within that framework. I think that the U.S. Constitution borrowed a lot from that idea of covenant, and even though it's a flawed document, we can still look at it as, this is our national covenant, and we can improve on it, we can
right.
reform it. So
Make it more overtly Christian,
yeah,
which everyone assumed up to the 20th
yeah,
century. And that's one thing about Christians today is most Christians are secularists. So they see this separation of church and state.
right,
If you mention Christian nation, they think theonomy, meaning tyranny, and so on and so
right.
forth. And we need to educate them. And I was going to ask you, how do we, you're doing it, how do we educate Christians that theonomy or covenant, these are not, or Christian nation is not a tyrannical concept? We're not forcing people to believe anything.
Well, the way I look at it, it's like this. I have a friend named Andrew Sandlin, California.
Oh,
Actually,
sure.
I used to know him a lot better back in the 90s. We worked together. But he has an interesting saying where he says that, the liberals look at the Reconstructionists and they think that we want to seize control of the government and enforce it through political means. And he says that's what they do.
That's what they do, exactly.
That's what the liberals do. And so they look at Christians talking
As if
about
we're like them.
a Christian America and they think that we want to seize control of the political apparatus and impose something on people.
Right.
But really, what we want is the freedom to homeschool our kids, to be able to speak out, to do Christian media without being censored by the social media groups, which are controlled by the secularists, and be
Right.
able to and we don't really want just a voice at the table. We do want to take over. We want the whole table,
Right.
but we want to do it through voluntarism. We want people to be converted and come
Sword of the
out.
spirit
Yeah,
as opposed
yeah.
to the physical sword.
We want people to come happily. And that's not
Right.
going to happen overnight. So we realize that. But we have to educate people that that's the goal. That's the final, you know, this is the final state is to make disciples of nations, not
Exactly.
just individuals, but entire nations.
Right. Because that's kind of what
And
Jesus
my book
commanded.
does get into that and quite a bit towards
Right.
the end. So
And you talk about recovering our American logos.
right.
And that's a broad, I mean, really broad historical overview. Can you explain what that means and why it's important for recapturing our civilization for Christ?
Yeah, I didn't struggle with this. I wanted to write on it, but I understand that there are some Christians that are going to misunderstand this. The term logos is in the Bible. First of all, you open up John chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, right?
All
Was
right.
the Logos. The Logos is Jesus Christ. Now, the Greeks had another idea of Logos, which was wisdom. And John is intentionally using that word Logos to appeal to
Totally.
A Greek audience, but also
Totally.
to the Hebrews, because to the Hebrews, Sophia was wisdom was wisdom, like in Greek the word Sophia, but there's a wisdom in Hebrew. Does not wisdom cry out in the streets, for instance? And then if you look throughout the Old Testament, wisdom is personified, and that person is Jesus Christ. Sometimes it's a woman, like, does she not like wisdom? But it's actually a type of Jesus Christ. Okay, so wisdom is Christ. Um, but what I say in the book is that every nation has its own national wisdom, because God didn't just create us as
Totally.
like
That's great.
God didn't just cookie cutter everybody. Like, you're a Christian, you're a Christian, you're a Christian, you're a Christian. Everybody has their own personality. Families have their own personalities. Nations have their own personalities. So
That's good.
one day God wants to see the collective personalities of the world come into the church. But the question I have always had is, are we going to give up our national personality, or are we going to bring that into the kingdom of God? And I discussed that in the book quite a bit. I have another book called The Fourth Political Theory and Biblical Perspective, which I get into that a little bit more. I wrote that prior to this one. But I believe, yeah, every nation has its national logos, and for America, it would be, you know, English Puritanism, some Scottish Presbyterianism, and so on. Now, we do have Catholics living in this country. We do have other types of continental Protestantism. A lot of Lutherans came in the 1800s, but the core foundation was the Puritan Logos. Okay. And, in another nation like Germany, theirs might be Lutheran. In Russia, it might be the Orthodox Church. And so a lot of people
Right.
go, oh, wait a minute, how can you say that? I'm Protestant. Well, I believe that in time, God's going to reform the entire church. But what they will have in that country is their own civilizational logos, and they'll understand things a little bit differently than the way that we understand them. Africa is very evangelical, but if you go to an evangelical church in Africa, their way of looking at things is very different.
Yeah, I was thinking about Hindu and Chinese and Japanese and all the different logos
Yeah.
that there would be, but within that Christian Christ-centered context.
There's an interesting interview that you should definitely watch with Tucker Carlson and George Galloway. George Galloway is a classical liberal, like he came out of the Labor Party,
Okay.
but he's also very strongly pro-life, and he's very anti-LGBTQ. He's very like strong on the family and moralism.
Hmm.
And so he's kind of like an oddball where um, the people that support him used to be the liberals, now they hate him
Of course.
because he's anti-war.
Right.
But the people that support him, the reason why he gets elected occasionally to parliament is because like the Black African churches, they see that he's pro-life and he's consistently he puts out tweets
Hmm.
on abortion all the time. The English
Okay.
abortion rate is now up to like 40%, 40% of pregnancies, he would say.
And now it's all perfectly legal.
And it's getting worse there. In other countries, it's getting better, and there it's getting worse. And so he's saying that now they're trying to push, assisted suicide laws and all this kind of
Right.
stuff. And so he's George Galloway is in line with what I'm talking about. Even
Hmm.
though he's not, I don't agree with him at every point, he's in line with this awakening that's happening.
Right.
And, there's another guy I listened to, he used to say, like, it probably what needs to happen in Europe is something that happened during Cromwell's time. The English Civil War and the Revolution, that's the only way that things might come around. Hopefully it doesn't come to violence, but there needs to be something very, very radical and drastic that
Right.
happens.
Revolutionary.
What's ironic is a lot of people in America would say, like, well, we don't want all these immigrants here. And most immigrants coming to America are actually Christians,
Hmm.
from South America and whatever, and in England as well. Most of the people are coming there, except for the Muslims, which are a very small portion of people living in England. There's Black Africans, and they're all are in these evangelical churches, and they're like really the only evangelicals in like the city of London that are very,
Hmm.
very outspoken. Are people
Hmm.
coming from other countries? So
Hmm.
I see God doing a work, and I see like we want England to be England. We don't want England to be Africa
Totally.
because England has a very special place in our civilizational logos. We came out of like the Celtic and Anglo-Saxon worlds. You don't have to be English or Irish to be part of that, but that's our wisdom came from them. And I
Hmm.
write about that in the book. There's certain
Yes.
symbols and literature that everybody should read and should know because it helps you to understand how Christ works to make England into a Christian nation and then America after that. So,
Yeah. Good stuff. I also very much love the perennial war of the Logoi.
yes. Did you like
And to
that
me, that,
part?
oh man, it was so powerful to see how the Christian Logos through time came to defeat paganism because it's superior,
Yeah.
you know. And I talk a lot about that in my book, is this overcoming of paganism
Okay.
that started with Abram, and it's been like this battle through history,
Right.
Abram and God's people versus the pagans. So talk a bit about this Logoi, and I mean, it's really deep and incredible stuff.
I did a video project with Eric Holmberg called The Abortion Matrix. And a lot of people know about it. It used to be called Massacre of Innocence. This is like part two of Massacre of Innocence, much more involved, more researched and developed. But one of the things I did was I read a book by G.K. Chesterton, who happens to be Roman Catholic, by the way. A lot of Reformed people love Chesterton. He's Roman Catholic. I joke about that. He did a book called The Everlasting Man, and it's about what you
Mhm.
were talking about. It's about the conversion of pagan nations into Christianity. And he starts in prehistoric times and he comes all the way up to the present.
It's
And
amazing.
what he says is that there are two types of societies. There's like a dark log. He doesn't call it this, but it's like a dark logos, which is kind of related to what the Greeks would have called Dionysus, and then the light logos, which is Apollo. And he doesn't use those terms in the book, but the idea is there is a philosophical term that got very popular in the 1800s. It was from ancient Greek philosophy, but it became more popular among sociologists, psychologists, philosophers in the 1800s. And the idea is that God prepares a society through the Apollonian Logos. And often what you see in history is he has a chapter in the book called The War of the Gods and Demons. And it's about how Carthage attacked Rome. Okay. Rome didn't attack Carthage, Carthage attacked Rome. And Carthage was involved with human sacrifice, sacrificing babies to Ashtaroth and Moloch, which are the same Phoenician deities that you know, the Philistines were um, sacrificing to, and the other Canaanite tribes were sacrificing to these. And Israel got involved with that too, the sacrifice of babies on the. So we were saying that that's like modern day abortion is child sacrifice.
Moloch, yes.
And so we need to understand that war. And the Romans were so, now
How long it's been going, right?
The
I mean,
Romans did human sacrifice too. Every pagan society has done that.
hmm
But the the Carthaginians did it like, by the tens of thousands. And they were
mm.
so horrified by what they might become if Carthage took over that they fought right down to the last man. And so
Wow.
finally, like Cannibal with their elephants, they just got stuck in the swamps of Italy and they just had to retreat. And that caused the downfall of Carthage. And what G.K. Chesterton says is that allowed Rome to spread throughout the world. And Rome was a lot more accommodating toward other religions.
Yeah, for
So that
sure.
allowed Christianity to flourish. It's a theory. There's another theory. There's a guy called I forget his name. I have it on my bookshelf. It's called the um I'm drawing a blank here. It's called it's called Eternity in Their Hearts.
Okay.
And it's a book about how there are a lot of pagan societies that have a Christ myth.
hmm
And when evangelists come to preach, they're like, oh, we know about this. We've been waiting for you to come. And they literally, I experienced that when I was in Russia. Like Russia was captured by this, very dark logos for a long time, communism.
Was that before communism fell? Where
That
you
was,
went there?
well, it was even afterward too, because a lot of
Okay.
people grew up in cities where there were no churches. Like I
Hmm.
was on a train and I met a guy from Siberia on the train, and yeah, it was, well, it was the Asian part of Russia. It was like I don't know if it's the Siberian region, but he was from Siberia, and he basically said that the only Christians in his town were Russian Orthodox priests. And there are other cities that were founded after the revolution that have no Orthodox churches. They had none at that time.
Hmm.
So there were kids that grew up like not knowing any religion at
Hmm.
all, just atheism. And so
Wow.
we send people into these colleges and universities and high schools to preach. And I had one guy tell me I could just see the people's faces, like they went from dark to light. Like literally
Hmm.
their light came into their eyes and just like this dark countenance dropped and they started to
That's
like
beautiful. That's beautiful.
understand about
Yeah.
Jesus Christ for the first time in their life. Whereas in this country, it's like people have been inoculated to the gospel.
Hmm. Right.
It's very hard when you come up and talk to someone, like if I mention the Puritans, oh, the Puritans, they were haters, they killed Indians, they hated women, no, or if you talk about Christianity, you're not one of those Christian nationalists, are you? And there's a real animosity toward Christianity, but in countries where they've had nothing,
Right.
there's often this emptiness, and they create myths. It's like they create like Lenin was a Christ figure, believe it or not.
Hmm.
And I have a book on Daniel where in the preface I talk about that a little bit about how the reason why they made the tomb of Lenin in Red Square was they wanted a Lenin cult.
Hmm.
And they wanted school children to like almost worship Lenin. That's why they had like pi young pioneers and they would say the Pledge of Allegiance, but to Lenin. And there's even a poem, it's almost like a prayer that talks about how, live your life in such a way that you won't be afraid to look into the eyes of your father, Lenin. And I talked to a
Yeah.
lot of kids that were brought up in pioneers, and then when they encountered the gospel, it's like, well, this is what, we were trained for was this. So it was like it's a different and then when they get a hold of the gospel, they were some of the most committed Christians because they were already
Mhm.
committed to something that was empty.
Right. Yeah. Materialism just can't
Yeah,
do it. Just
yeah.
pure materialism cannot do it.
That's I also find that's true of people in Mediterranean cultures, like Muslims, Jews, even like Italians and Greeks to a certain extent, who had a form of religion but denying its godliness and its power. And then when they find out something that's powerful, they want it. And
Mm.
it's hard to convert them at first, but when they do become converted, they become the best Christians.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like we're looking for. We're not looking for like just, this is not ethno-nationalism we're talking about. It's not like just like white Protestant Anglo-Saxon Christians.
Hmm.
It's everybody, but grab a hold of that vision for America that our founders had and own it and, preach it to the world.
Yeah. One of the reasons I think, and I argue in my book, is that we're at the end of a 300 to 400 year experiment in Western history called
Hmm.
secularism. The
Yes.
Enlightenment, and it birthed secularism, and this promise of God as persona non grata in society. We can make a society without God, and personal, put it in your closet in your house or church, fine, but no impact on the greater culture. And it just hasn't worked. And so there's nothing to come after that. There's no more secularism because it's more of the same, and
Right.
people are looking for hope. That's why I think your book, it's a great timing that something is happening and people are looking for that thing you talked about, that something real, something
Yeah.
real.
I have another book. My part four of my book kind of dovetails off of another book I wrote called The Fourth Political Theory and Biblical Perspective. And in that book, I cover three philosophers, and none of them are Protestants, or none of them are really evangelicals. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
There's Ray Dalio, Samuel
Mm-hmm.
Huntington, and then Alexander Dugin, who's a Russian philosopher.
Who
And
you
so,
quote in the book a lot.
yeah, and
Dugan.
so Dugin is he calls it post-liberalism.
Mm-hmm.
And post-liberalism doesn't mean what you think it means. It means like we've eliminated everything else. Now liberalism is your only choice.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like you said, you can't just have more of that.
Right.
So it creates a vacuum. It
Exactly.
creates people who are like, they're
Exactly.
postmodernist to the place where they used to say, there is no God, God is dead. And now you talk to them and you say, like, if they hear God is dead, they'll be like, who died exactly? Did you know him? Is that, it's one of the jokes that he uses is that, and literally there's a lot of young people growing up in the West and former communist countries and even like secular liberal countries who just don't know anything about religion.
Right.
And
Zero.
they just assume that like that this is not. And so now we're starting to see that in Europe and then even in America where there's younger people, especially young men, who are gravitating toward the more traditional forms of Christianity. And you think it would happen in evangelical churches, and it is, but it's also happening in the more traditional
Right.
faiths as well. Like,
Yeah.
you're seeing a lot of people like being attracted towards, Eastern Orthodoxy and these older right, like um, the what they call the Latin rite of I forget what they call it, but it's the Latin rite of
Right. I think you're
Catholicism.
right. Yeah.
And they want something ancient. They
Right.
want something traditional. They don't
Something
want
rooted
they don't want like the
somewhere.
whiz bang evangelical
Right.
experience. They want something that's like, and you see a lot of interest in that. R.C. Sproul used to say that he would go to ministers' meetings and they'd go around the room. How many of you do contemporary worship on Sunday morning? How many of you do mixed? Like they'll do like a service of traditional and a service of, you'll see that like 11 a.m. is
Yeah. We've been to churches
contemporary,
like that.
9 a.m. is and they go around the whole room and everyone would give their thing and RC would just say, neither one, we just do traditional. And everyone would turn their head and they would go like, what's wrong with you? Don't you want to
Mhm.
reach young people? And he was like, that's not our job to reach young people. Our job is to glorify God in the
Hmm.
worship service. But then
Hmm.
as a result of that, they have, well, he's R.C. Sproul too, but as a result of that, they have a Bible college where people from all over the country want to come to that Bible college.
Hmm.
It's not RTS, it's a Bible college that's on the campus of St. Andrews.
Okay.
And it's a great school, and they train up, a lot of good reformers,
Yeah.
and so it's like that church has been very successful doing traditional hymns and traditional Puritan
Right.
theology, Puritan eschatology, postmillennial eschatology, and that's what people are attracted to that.
Yeah.
And I've heard
More so than ever. More
I've
so
heard
than ever.
pastors in Orlando lament over this. They've said that
Hmm.
like, oh, this is becoming a little Geneva, and I was like, oh, I wish it was. I wish it
Yep.
was
From
becoming
your
that.
word to mouth to God's ears.
You're exaggerating a little bit, but I do think that that's on the horizon. I really do.
Yeah. And then lastly, I want to talk about, you mentioned the term ethno-nationalism. So like you said also that Christian nationalist or being
Right.
or Christian nationalism is an epithet and somehow it's so on. So talk about why a Christian nation isn't ethno-nationalism.
Right.
Why is it not?
Well, because it never was. Like, even if you go back to the Old Testament, people think that like the covenant was based on bloodline, that if you were a descendant of Abraham, that you're one of God's elect. But Abraham had people in his own household who weren't his descendants,
Mm-hmm.
who became part of the nation of Israel later on. And even like when they came out of Egypt, there was something called the mixed multitude,
Right. Right.
where there were children of these other Hebrews that were with the not the Jews, but the other people that were part of the Hebrew nation that were not descendant of Abraham, but they were there. And as long as they were part of the covenant, as long as they, did the Passover meal, they came out of Egypt. So as long as you were part of the covenant, you were welcome.
Hmm.
Um, Joseph had the half tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh.
Mm-hmm.
Who is their mother?
Uh,
Mother was an Egyptian princess.
okay.
So I mean, right there, it's like, well, wait a minute. There were two tribes of Israel who were half Egyptian. So
Hmm.
it was never like you got to be a pure
Right. Right.
bloodline coming. So there are always ethnic people, immigrants, what they call sojourners in the Bible, aliens who are welcome into Israel. And as long as they followed the covenant, within a generation, they were Israel. They're part of Israel.
Hmm.
And then in Paul's time, he said that not all of Israel are of Israel. You could be a descendant of Abraham, but Jesus said, I could turn these rocks into sons of Abraham,
Hmm.
stones. It's like just because you're a son of Abraham doesn't mean that you're a son of God.
Right.
The
Right. That's a
seed of
great,
Abraham is
great point.
Jesus. The seed of Abraham is Jesus Christ, not his
Right.
bloodline. Even though
Right.
Jesus was part of the bloodline, Jesus himself had several Gentile women in his bloodline,
Right.
right? So it's like, you had Rahab, you had Bathsheba, and you had Ruth.
Ruth. Right.
And Bathsheba, that's a different story. It's controversial, but she was probably not descended directly from Israel. So it's interesting that actually there's a series on that you can start watching on Amazon. They actually have Bathsheba in the series is not an Israelite, which is interesting. It's a
Hmm.
theory. I happen to subscribe to it. But so anyway, Israel was never covenanted by ethno-nationalism. They were covenanted by faith and obedience.
Hmm.
And so if you want to be part of a Christian America, then embrace the American covenant, embrace the fact that our founders loved Jesus Christ. Not all of them did,
Right.
but embrace
Right.
the ones that did and learn from them
Mm-hmm.
and learn we have our own American mythology where we like to make certain people into more super Christians than they were actually,
Mm-hmm.
but it's still like it's a story that we tell. There are songs that we sing. Paul Revere, a lot of people don't know it, but he was a Knoxian Cromwellian revolutionary.
Mm.
And we might sing a song about, learn a poem about Paul Revere's ride. But what goes along with that is the idea, like, and I have that in the book that, Paul Revere, his
Yeah.
father wanted him to go to the Anglican church, but he would always like run over to the Puritan church and hear
Mm-hmm.
about the revolution, hear
Mm.
about the Sons of Liberty and things like that. And so that's how he
Right.
got involved with that.
Yeah.
And he and his father had some disagreements over that. So there are these little stories that people are unaware of, and I tried to not just repeat like the David Barton, wall builders quotes, and things like that. I have some of those in
Sure.
there, but I tried to put in some research that people have never heard of before too. So
Well, good. Yeah, I think that's very helpful because this is such an issue of contention, and it's such a. I mean, there's some points there because of this unlimited illegal immigration by leftists who hate America and hate the West. So
right.
the more they dilute it, the more. So I see that pushback against that. So I think we should listen and understand what's being said, but nonetheless, that's a very powerful argument, I think, of what a covenant, a Christian nation actually is. So, any last words you'd like to
Yeah,
share?
I want to comment on that. I have another book called The Fourth Political Theory, and it's this one right here. I'm actually, it's a long book, so I'm actually in the process of
Fourth political theory?
Fourth Political Theory and Biblical Perspective, and
Okay.
it's Dalio, Huntington, and Dugan. But I also have many other authors I cover too that all basically say the same thing. And then this is you saw this earlier. This. I had to really write this book first before I wrote this one, even though this one has been in the works for many years, because it gave me like another larger perspective, not just
Mm,
America, but what about all the nations? We expect
yeah,
every nation in the world to become Puritan. Well, not necessarily, but we expect them to become Christian.
exactly.
So Christian
Their
Brazil,
heritage wasn't Puritan.
yeah. I mean, there's a big evangelical movement in Brazil,
Hmm.
but there's also a lot of Catholics. So their
Right,
expression of what Christian Brazil is going to be very different than what ours
right,
is.
right. And that's okay.
Um, so you mentioned modernism, where all modernist political philosophy, theology, philosophy in general hates tradition, the family, faith, anything that's ancient. Everything's got to be modern. The more modern, the better.
Hmm.
And we need to move away from these superstitions about God and, miracles. And that was like the modernist movement among philosophy. And then it spilled over into political theory. And so in the beginning, liberalism was about individualism. It was about individuality. We all have individual
Right.
rights and so on. But eventually what happened was when people forgot God, as Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, when the
Hmm.
West forgot God, Russia forgot God, but the West forgot God too, we began looking to the state to provide our rights.
Right.
And then wherever your source of your rights is, wherever the
They,
source of your law is, there is your God.
mm,
And so now the state becomes a God walking on earth, like Hegel said.
right, right, right,
And there's another philosopher called Jean-Paul Sartre, and he noticed that he was not a Christian, he was not a believer,
right.
but he noticed that as we look to the state to give us more and more individual rights, the state becomes more and more powerful. And what happens? It becomes a tyrant. And then we live in this prison without walls. That's what he
Mm,
called it.
right.
All
Because
right.
there's no way out, right?
And so you had liberalism, and then communism arose, Marxism arose as a challenge to liberalism. We need to like think about they saw that like capitalism without, capitalism, which is just greed, not based on the Protestant work ethic, but just greed, wanting more and more money, it's going to oppress the poor. So that's why Marx came along. But then Marx himself, he came up with a modernist theory that also hated God and hated, you know, the family. And
Private property.
even like the modern day Russians, like they're not communists. They know that communism destroyed the family in that country. They know that, and they're trying to reverse that because they have a declining birth rate and all this kind of thing.
Right, right,
And then
right.
fascism was the other political theory. And fascism came from the right wing, where we do want some tradition. We want the Nordic gods, and but
Hmm.
it was very pagan, and it was based on race.
Right, right, right.
And so, but also there was a hatred toward other nationalities, toward everything that wasn't German. And in Italy, it was a little bit different, but it was similar. And so those were the three modernist political theories. And so what I say is, well, we need a fourth political theory, and for
Mm,
America, it should be neo-Puritanism.
mm,
It's a government and a society and a culture, most importantly, the culture
right,
it's based on God, faith, faith, family, and freedom, basically is what they call it. Faith, family, and freedom
right,
is faith in God, the family as a building block, and then
right,
liberty under the law. Not liberty like you can do whatever you want, but liberty in obedience to God's covenant.
right. That's
So,
the only true liberty comes from.
and that's not modernism. It's something that's very ancient.
Right,
So,
right.
like the more ancient, the better. So,
Exactly, exactly. Wonderful. Yeah. So you argue for that in the book. So I highly recommend it. It's great learning, great reading, scope of history stuff, and it's another contribution, another brick in the wall as we're all doing our little bit like Nehemiah and building the wall. So thank you for your time. I really appreciate you and all the work and effort and time in your life of investing in all this and then sharing it so others can benefit. So I really appreciate it.
And it is on Amazon,
Okay,
and you can get the Kindle version and the virtual voice Audible version too. So it's
great.
all
And your
and
website.
your book is awesome too. I actually bought it the other day and I
Well,
started
thank
it and
you.
I just bought it 2 days ago, but it's very, very similar to what I did. And I think that kind
Going
of
back.
like two kindreds. So I really think that this is the Holy Spirit that's revealing this to people. And then in
Amen.
time, we're going to see more and more of it, which will be great. People need a better understanding of what we're talking about. It's not a top-down, rigid, oh,
No,
you need to do what the
not at
government tells
all.
you. It's
Exactly.
people volunteering freely in the day of the Lord, as the
Yeah.
psalm says.
Yeah. Praise God. Good stuff. So thanks again. And this is Eschatology Matters, part of the Fight Laugh Feast Network. Have a great day.
Sure.
Bye.